Welcome everyone. My name is Hannah Pausch and I am the program director with Ag Forestry. We are delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, this first of the 4-week series on collaboration and collaborative governments. I have a couple of announcements and then I will introduce you to our presenter. Just share my screen really quickly. So at Ag Forestry, our mission is to cultivate leaders who communicate, collaborate, inspire, and serve. And through our 2021 webinars, we are taking a deep dive into each of these core competencies. Back in February, we explored communication, specifically building our skills in emotional intelligence and courageous conversations. If you missed that series, you can find the recordings on our website at agforestry.org. This month, you're all here as we kick off this Collaborate series. And in June, we're hosting another 4-week series, Inspire and Serve, where we'll explore the power of stories and gain skills for telling our stories. And Class 41 is graduating next Friday. I know we have a number of Class 41 folks on the call today. You have waited an entire year for this final piece of your Ag Forestry experience. So we are excited and anxious to celebrate with you next week. I hope that you will all consider joining us as we celebrate Class 41. There is still time to purchase tickets for the virtual graduation, which will take place next Friday, April 16th from 6 to 8 p.m. This will include class awards, commencement, and we have some entertainment coming from the Peterson brothers. Additionally, this year, the graduation auction is online, so everyone can participate. It is open now, and it will be open through next Wednesday, April 14th. There are some great auction items, some especially cool experiences throughout all over the state. So you can check that out and buy tickets for the celebration on our website at agforestry.org. And last, we have some exciting news about our annual golf tournament this year. It's 2 tournaments. We are hosting an East Side and a West Side tournament, and there is early birdie pricing through the 19th of this month. So again, you can find more information on our website, and we hope to see you out on the course this summer. And now, the moment you have all been waiting for, I'd like to introduce you to Michael Kern. Michael brings more than 25 years of experience in helping diverse groups reach common ground on public policy issues in Washington and throughout the Pacific Northwest. He currently serves as the director of the William D. Ruckelshaus Center and has since 2010. The center is a collaborative public policy effort of WSU and UW, and Michael himself is an official Kusky. In his role at the center, he's responsible for faculty, staff, and his advisory board development and management, organizational and strategic planning, fundraising, and communications. He is also an associate professor at WSU Extension and an affiliate associate professor at the UW Evans School of Public Policy and Governance. Michael is a 2-time UW graduate, including a Master of Public Administration degree from the Evans School. Michael, we are so thrilled to have this opportunity to learn from you this month. Thank you so much for joining us. I know that we won't be able to hear you all clap, but in wherever space you are, please help me in welcoming Michael Kern.
Thank you, Hannah. I appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for joining for what I hope will be the first of 4 lunch hours that we'll spend together during this month talking about collaborative governance. I'm gonna have to update the webpage. It's actually now more than 30 years of experience. I'm getting incredibly old. So appreciate that introduction. As I mentioned, first of 4 webinars. This week, it'll be an intro to collaborative governance and what that is, what it means. Then next week, we're gonna talk about some collaborative competencies and how to assess your sort of ability to participate in collaborative processes. And then the 3rd week, one of my colleagues is going to introduce the concept of situation assessments and how they relate to collaboration and collaborative processes. And then you've actually had sort of brief cameos by 2 of our guests for the 4th week. We're going to talk about collaboration in action, and Paul Ward, who you just briefly saw, and Urban Eberhardt, who you saw a little while ago, are going to talk to us about their own experiences with collaborative processes and working with each other. So I hope you'll find today worthwhile and the whole series worthwhile. This is part of the center's, for us, the Ruckelshaus Center's collaborative capacity building initiative, intended to help individuals and organizations better understand and initiate and participate and lead collaborative public policy efforts, which receives funding from the Murdoch Charitable Trust. So we're grateful to them for helping us to do that. Typically, we'd be doing these kinds of events in person as opposed to a webinar. So we're going to try and make this as interactive as we can by using chats and polls, to help out with that. And the first thing I'd like to do along that line is ask Hannah if she could maybe post this poll. I know it's a little bit of an ironic question to ask. What percentage of you is in the room at the moment? I know none of us are in the room, but in terms of focused on what we're doing today, I know that we're all become incredibly adept at multitasking and being distracted. But I'd love to just have everybody take a moment and think about what percent of you is really focused on what we're doing today. And I'll start off just by, as an example, and say I'm about 90% in the room right now. And then once you've answered the poll, maybe just put in the chat, where is the rest of you? My answer is, I'm wondering, about 10% of me is wondering how I'm going to fit all that I'd like to share with you into 60 minutes, or I guess it's about almost 50 minutes now. So once you've answered what percentage of you is actually in the room with us today, maybe just put in the chat where the rest of you is, so that we can all kind of get a feel for that. So just take a few seconds to answer the poll question. And it looks like we can even vote too. So I'm going to do my vote as well if I'm able to do that. Oh, no, it looks like I can't vote. But if you go ahead, do a little vote, and Hannah will close it in, I don't know, another 30 to 60 seconds, something like that. And we'll see where the rest of you are, if you want to put it in the chat. So I can see we have someone who's thinking about other online events. Paul's hair is on fire. We don't have an exact percentage. Here we go. Let's see, how are we doing? Got a few people who are only here about 30%, but it looks like the bulk, we have some people who are here 100%, but looks like the bulk are around 80%, 70, 80%, 90%. So that's really great. For those of you who are more down in the 40s or the 60s, I'll try and bring that up as we move along by having some interesting content. I can see with your 4 kids on spring break, hoping for a negative COVID result. Oh my gosh, yeah. All in, excellent. Oh yeah, boy, how many dogs want attention? I actually have this theory that dogs are behind this whole conspiracy. Theory of mine is that dogs are behind the whole pandemic. If you think about who's benefiting from this, with their owners all being home all the time. Thinking about how I'm going to get all today's vineyard work done. Absolutely. Oh, I hear you. Okay, well, like I said, we'll see if we can bring that percentage up. Let me share my screen with you. I've got some slides to go along with what I'm going to talk about today, and that's the topic. If you're having any challenges with the tech, please let us know in the chat window. And Hannah's going to be paying attention to that, and she'll help correct. But today we're going to talk about an introduction to collaborative governance. Here's our objectives. I'm going to try and introduce, define, and discuss collaborative governance. Introduce and discuss the stages and criteria for how you evaluate ripeness of a collaborative process. If we have time, get to some recurring lessons about collaborative governance. And then I'm going to introduce the Ruckelshaus Center as an example of an institution that fosters collaborative governance or collaborative public policy making. A couple of different ways you could talk about this work. I want to share a couple of caveats. I'm not going to try and teach you to be a facilitator or a mediator or a negotiator over lunch today. And this series focuses on a specific type of collaborative governance, which I'll define shortly, and what it looks like on the ground and in practice, and when it's appropriate, because it's not always an appropriate approach to policymaking, how you can make it effective as a sponsor or a participant, a decision maker or a facilitator. And the reason why we're going to do that is because in your career in natural resource management, you're going to be called upon to work effectively with people inside and outside of your organization to create and implement public policy. So this series was going to be about some aspects of how you can be effective in that task. That's what we're going to try and do. I also want to at least touch on introducing the Ruckelshaus Center as an example of a provider of collaborative governance services to try and take that from being theoretical to being applied. So let's get going. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean by collaborative governance. Maybe if you could type into the chat box what the term collaborate means to you, and I'll just take a couple second pause to give you a chance to maybe put a few answers to that. What the term collaborate means to you, or what you think about when you hear the word collaborate. And I see multiple perspectives are included, working together for a common goal with everyone's ideas, listening, yeah, working together. Towards a good solution. Yeah, so working together comes up a lot, and that's great. I mean, I think for too many people, the term collaborate can mean working with other people with the inferred postscript because you have to. And that's kind of the reason why I put this cartoon up, because inside, sometimes people were thinking or feeling like the person in this cartoon, that the collaborative process would work better without the other person. But the term collaborate, you're spot on. Literally, it does mean to work together, to co-labor. The first definition in Webster's dictionary is to work jointly with others together, especially in an intellectual endeavor. But collaborative governance means something more specific, and at its best, it's not entered into because you have to, like this person is feeling, but because you want to, or because you expect that you're going to achieve more by doing so. So collaborative governance as a field is still really maturing. It's in a constant state of flux, and there's all these new ideas and definitions and theories and subfields that are woven in. And it's a term, collaborative governance, that means many different things to different people. So kind of like an umbrella term. That's why I have this umbrella up here. And it's being used for all these different things. I'm going to put up a bunch of terms on this slide. And it can mean all these, it's being used for all these different things that are listed on the slide, and a lot of other things. And it uses the toolkit of ADR. So I want to put up another poll, wondering, so Hannah, if you could put up the poll of what does ADR mean? What does it stand for? So if you could just take a couple seconds and put in your vote. These are anonymous polls, right? So don't have to worry about getting it right or wrong. Just go ahead and take your best shot. All right, so despite my best attempt, I didn't fool most of you in terms of what ADR stands for. So I need to do one more click. It should come in at the top. Yep, so the acronym does stand for Alternative Dispute Resolution. So collaborative governance uses this toolkit of alternative dispute resolution and applies it to public policy. And I have another poll for you. Where did ADR begin? If we could put that poll up, where did alternative dispute resolution come from? It come from the civil courts, from labor management negotiations, from family law, from international diplomacy, or from small claim courts. And this is multiple choice, so you could choose more than one. We'll give you just a few more seconds on this one. So pretty good spread here. And that makes sense because it was kind of a trick question, because all these places, alternative dispute resolution techniques kind of arose in all these different places, in the civil courts, in labor management negotiations, family law, international diplomacy, small claims court. These were all places where people had been applying alternative dispute resolution techniques and tactics as a way to resolve problems and challenges and begin solving two-party conflicts and even multi-party conflicts. And so after people started thinking, I wonder if you could solve public policy challenges this way, with all these techniques that had been developed in, to solve international diplomacy challenges or labor management negotiations, all that kind of stuff. So for the last 45 years or so, they've been applied to public policy, especially natural resources. So the application to public policy really kind of arose out of the 1960s peace movement, and in the 1970s demand for more open and inclusive and accessible bottom-up as opposed to top-down government, where more and alternative voices were heard. The first successful public policy collaborative governance process was actually in the it was in Western Washington in 1975 on the Snohomish River. Now, in the term alternative dispute resolution, what is it an alternative to? In the legal sector, it's alternative to the courts. So the parties to a dispute develop a solution themselves with the help of a neutral. In public policy, it's alternative to the executive, legislative, or judicial processes, which are the typical way that we resolve challenges or conflicts. And in both cases, the results, if you reach a resolution, if the parties themselves reach consensus, then the results are typically returned to those venues. So if the parties in a dispute in a legal process with the help of a mediator or some other third party reach a resolution, they bring that back to the judge who can accept it as a resolution of their conflict. Similarly, the parties in a multi-party public policy challenge can come back and say, we've reached an agreement, and the legislature can adopt that, or the governor can agree to that as or an agency can decide that'll be their policy. So this term collaborative governance is becoming more commonly used to refer to those processes where they're applied to public policy and coalescing around the term. But again, it's an umbrella term. It's used for all these different processes. So you have to be clear what type of type you're examining or involved in. And so more specific definitions have emerged over the past decade of collaborative governance. And I want to kind of use some of the definitions that we're using in the work we're doing. I'm going to put up a few definitions that have emerged over the last few years, and I'm just putting up some of the key ideas. Not the full definitions, but Ansel and Gash in 2008 talk about a governing arrangement for their definition of collaborative governance, in which one or more public agencies directly engage non-state stakeholders in a collective decision-making process that's formal, consensus-oriented, and deliberative, and that aims to make or implement public policy or manage public programs or assets. And then in 2012, Emerson and Nabachi, another pair of scholars and thinkers in the field, talk about processes and structures of public policy decision-making and management that engage people constructively across the boundaries of public agencies, levels of government, or the public, private, and civic spheres to carry out a public purpose that could not otherwise be accomplished. In 2018, the University Network for Collaborative Governance had come up with a long definition as part of a strategic plan that I'm not going to read, but you can see a couple of the key ideas they add. Most importantly is that it encompasses any method, model, or process that's deliberative and consensual. So you can really kind of think about it as sort of this inverted triangle where you have collaboration itself at the top. And then below that, this idea of collaborative governance, which is this whole variety of processes that kind of have in common that they involve reaching across traditional governing boundaries. But the subset we're going to focus on have the following characteristics: that they're multi-party, that they're consensus seeking, they're typically facilitated or mediated. In other words, there's a third party involved that is an expert on process, but doesn't have a stake in the outcome. So they're just focusing on the process, not on the content. They're not a party to the dispute or to the challenge. And that there's a particular public policy challenge that is being focused on. So there's that sort of inverted triangle that is the focus. So I'm kind of hoping you'll come out of this series thinking about collaboration more in lines and collaborative governance in the lines of this cartoon, where you get a group of people together who see things differently, have different circumstances and experiences, and all hold a piece of the truth or the complexity of the situation, a piece of the solution, and can create a cohesive whole. So a couple of kind of key ideas or concepts that kind of can help you to understand collaborative governance and a collaborative process. One really important idea is this stages of collaborative decision making. And our colleagues at Sacramento State University and the National Policy Consensus Center are sort of where a lot of these ideas were organized, but I owe it to my colleague Amanda Murphy for putting it into this nice graphic format. So I want to make sure to call that out. So this is kind of a nice way to think about the stages of a collaborative process. And it's not unusual when people think of agreement, of collaborative policymaking or collaborative governance, that they think of the agreement seeking phase, that sort of blue middle column here. I guess I can use my, I think you can see my pointer here, that they think about this blue sort of middle column when they think of collaborative governance or conflict resolution in general on public policy. And getting people around a table to reach consensus and settle arguments and resolve conflicts and reach agreements. That is obviously a key important part of it, but there's really these 3 stages and 5 phases. The convening stage, which has assessing, planning, and organizing as sort of important phases of that stage. And then of course the agreement seeking phase, which has an education phase to it, negotiating and resolving as part of it, and then implementation. None of the other stuff matters if you don't get to implementing the results. That's really when the rubber hits the road. And under implementation, really there's implementing, but there's also monitoring, evaluating, and adaptively managing. Now, it's useful to show this as a linear process. I mean, you can see there's this nice set of arrows that shows everything moving on this nice path, you know, constantly moving towards implementation. But in reality, it doesn't always work that way. You're really moving back and forth somewhat, and you're looping from implementation back to convening or to agreement seeking. You know, you may very well move from assessing to organizing and to educating and to negotiating. And then you may realize maybe there's a need for further education, or maybe you need to go back and you may need to go back and reorganize. It is nice to show it as this nice linear process, but reality is a little messier. Similarly, this chart makes it look like everything takes the same amount of time. I mean, all these columns are the same width. But in reality, you might be in the convening phase for years and years. Or maybe agreement seeking takes a very long time. And really implementation, that column should never end, because it's the rare public policy challenge where you finish implementing, you know, like, oh boy, we finished that. We're never going to need to deal with that policy challenge again. We've completely finished implementing that. I mean, the more typical thing is that you have to stay everlastingly at something. And the stages tend to not take all the same time. So the agreement seeking stage can't be effectively reached without the prep work of the convening stage. And it doesn't result in real progress without an effective implementation stage. When I teach case studies at our universities, I have the students break the cases down into these stages. What happened in the convening stage? What happened in the agreement seeking stage? What happened in the implementation stage? So this is a really useful graphic. And again, if we had more time, it would be great to stop at each of these points and have nice long conversations, but I'm trying to sort of give you an overall introduction to some of this stuff in the hour that we have. And also to try and get through with enough time that maybe we can have some questions at the end. A related field to collaborative governance that's sort of also under that umbrella I showed you at the beginning is deliberative dialogue, or it's also sometimes called dialogue and deliberation. Either way, it goes by the acronym D&D, which in this case doesn't mean Dungeons and Dragons. Its practitioners focus on strengthening democracy by improving the quality of interactions and fostering informed and productive dialogue and deliberation, as opposed to simple win-lose debate. So I'm in debt to another one of my colleagues, Kevin Harris, at the Ruckelshaus Center for introducing me to this slide, and then in debt to University of Wisconsin Extension for putting this slide together, which does a really nice job of contrasting that sort of win-lose debate on the far left side and kind of what you tend to see in that type of interaction, competing, arguing, etc. From as you sort of move along, the next step over from debate to discussion, and then to what you kind of get into when you get into dialogue and deliberation and the quality of those types of discussions. You're probably familiar with the dynamic that a lot of public policy really centers on debate. Particularly if you look at maybe the national discussions that are happening these days, it's considered a major achievement if you get to discussion. And collaborative governance, one of the real values of it is that it gets you into dialogue and deliberation. It's really kind of transformative, as opposed to people just being stuck in competing and arguing and promoting their own opinions. So I wish we had more time to get into this arena, but I just really wanted to introduce this and show some of the differences between dialogue and deliberation and some of the more common types of political interactions that we often get stuck in. The National Coalition for Deliberation and Dialogue, NCDD, is a great place. Their website's a great resource for learning more about this type of thing. Another useful diagram that I wanted to put in front of you, then you could dig into more if you're interested. This is from the leading organization on public participation, IAP2, which stands for the International Association for Public Participation, which is another term on that umbrella. And I'm seeing someone would be interested in a reference list, and yeah, I'm sure we can make that happen. This shows the levels of engagement that are kind of possible under public participation, which is another sort of cousin of collaborative governance, and the goals and promises and examples. So as you can see, there's an increasing level of public impact as you move from the left to the right. Inform is a pretty common and sometimes appropriate level of engaging the public. It's pretty one-sided. It's pretty common and appropriate, but it can often lead to frustration and rebellion from the public. Can often feel one way and sort of token. On the other side, empower is pretty rare. That delegation of we will implement what you decide by a government authority. It's often difficult for a governmental agency to completely delegate their legal or constitutional authority. They often fear the loss of control as well. But many collaborative governance processes do include elements of the first three and often get into the fourth column, that collaboration element. And this chart is another one where our colleagues at the Sacramento State were sort of the origin of the material, but I owe my colleague Amanda Murphy for the layout. It's a perspective on criteria for initiating a collaborative process, because it's not always appropriate. Not every policy challenge is appropriate for a collaborative process. So the way that you figure that out is that you assess the situation, often through interviewing the involved parties to answer these types of questions, and evaluate what we call the ripeness of the situation, the favorability. We're going to talk about the Ruckelshaus Center in a little bit, and we have our own set of project criteria, which also help us to evaluate ripeness of the process for a collaborative process, but also for our fit as the third party to be involved. And you'll see some overlap between those. I want to point out that I won't walk through each of these individually. You can take a look here and see the types of things that practitioners look for to see if a situation is ripe for a collaborative process. You can also, as a potentially involved party in a collaborative process, think about these things to determine if it makes sense for you to be engaged, or to think about it, maybe convening a collaborative group, whether these things exist. I do want to point out that the colors and the size and the order of the items on this chart don't signify anything specific. A bigger box doesn't mean that it's more important. They're not in a particular order, and blue doesn't mean anything versus purple. I also want to point out that if you look at the upper left where it says no constitutional rights or basic societal values are at stake, it's worth pointing out that that criteria is really referring to when the degree is so strong that those rights and values are at stake. So it really isn't possible to say that there's any public policy process that does not involve constitutional rights or societal values at all. But this is kind of when it's they're so strong that they're kind of at stake. So as an example, let's say that the policy issue was that's in question was, do the treaties that the tribes signed in the 1850s in the state of Washington entitle them to half of the harvestable salmon? That was a policy challenge that was faced in our state, and that was probably not something that made a lot of sense to sit down and have a collaborative process to resolve. Those were some very basic constitutional rights and societal values, and it needed the certainty of a judicial process. And ultimately, that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of the tribes, that they did in fact have that right, and that the treaties entitled them to that right. Once that right was established, we've had a number of collaborative processes on related issues that were in fact very productive. For example, there was a large collaborative process that resulted in the establishment of the co-management relationship between the state and the tribes to manage that resource. And every year there's collaborative processes that look at questions like, what should the salmon harvest regime look like for the 2021 season, for example. So that's kind of a distinction on related issues, and one was appropriate and others, one was not appropriate, others are appropriate. Let's see, I'm heading into the home stretch of information I'm presenting so that we can get to the point where I can answer your questions about what these have brought up. So I want to transition and just spend a little time with you talking about the Ruckelshaus Center as an example. And I'm actually doing pretty well in terms of having time to do some Q&A with you. Okay, so the Ruckelshaus Center. The center is an example of an institution that fosters collaborative governance and collaborative public policy. You can see on the slide our mission and our vision. You can visit our website for more information. We're named for our founder and our advisory board chair, William D. Ruckelshaus, devoted to his approach to collaborative public policy and problem solving. Bill was a really amazing figure and public-private sector leader in recent American history. He passed away in 2019, but I had the distinct privilege of being able to work with him as our board chair for just over a decade. The center is a joint effort of Washington's 2 research universities. Was developed in response to requests from community leaders. Now, we're hosted on the UW side by the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, and at WSU by WSU Extension. And Extension also provides our administration. So that's why Hannah mentioned that I'm WSU faculty and UW affiliate faculty. So I mentioned a little earlier about our project criteria. And here they are. You can take a look at them. They guide an assessment of the appropriateness of the center's involvement and in a policy situation. And you can see the overlap and differences with those conditions favorable to initiate a collaborative process. Typically, we apply them by having conversations with leaders from involved governments, stakeholder groups, and private citizens and others to determine if an issue is ripe and if the parties are amenable to our involvement. We consult with our advisory board and our executive committee. These are the primary criteria. We also have secondary criteria. So I mentioned the advisory board. This is a photo of just a subset of our advisory board. It's actually a very big group. There's about 45 of them, intentionally big so that pretty much anybody from kind of whatever sector or geography or what part of the state they're from will see somebody that they identify with or works in their field. They feel politically represented, etc. It's a prominent and influential group. Wide range of sectors and geographies and perspectives, public and private sector leaders, and then ex officio members from both our universities, and then also a Democrat and a Republican from each chamber of the state legislature. You will notice, actually, if you look on towards the left side and the right side of this photo, that you will see Paul Ward and Urban Everhart in this picture. So they're going to be in the fourth, we're featuring them in the fourth webinar in this series. And they are, let's see, our funding is also a unique mix of public and private sources. So a little bit of core support from the universities. A lot of our work is done in fee-for-service grants and contracts. And then we have our own 501c3 foundation, the Ruckelshaus Center Foundation, that does private fundraising so that we can preserve our independence, our ability to get involved early or stay late, do things for the good of the field like research and scholarship, such as this collaborative capacity building initiative that we're doing this webinar series as part of with the support of the Murdoch Foundation. So let's see. This is a list of our services. If you put them all together, it kind of gets down to helping people work together to identify and solve problems, make collaborative decisions, reach lasting agreements. I won't go into a bunch of detail about these services. Amanda is going to talk about situation assessments in a couple of weeks. The initial consultation kind of fits in with that, the assessment that I've been talking about. That's an early stage of collaborative governance. And in fact, if you look at these, you can kind of see how they fit in with that stages of collaborative governance that I mentioned. The assessment at the beginning, the process design, the education or common information base, the facilitating and managing obviously fits in with agreement seeking, and et cetera, et cetera. So that these are the services that we provide. And we've had the opportunity to be involved in a whole bunch of different stuff. I think our kind of core competency when we began was natural resource management issues, like would be the focus of most of the work you guys are probably doing as members of the Ag Forestry Leadership Program. And you can see a lot of that here, but we've also our areas of expertise are things that there's subject matter expertise at our two universities. And you can imagine between University of Washington and Washington State University, the subject matter expertise is really broad. So we've done work in the health policy area, and we're working in criminal sentencing. We've done disaster recovery and hazards and resilience, economic development, and outdoor recreation, biofuels, and other, clean energy, land use. You can see just a whole really wide range of things in addition to agriculture, natural resources, and a lot of other different topics. And if we had unlimited time, I'd love to talk to you about the details of each of these projects, but more than happy to address any of those in Q&A if you have particular interest in any of those past or current projects. And I should say that UW and WSU faculty, staff, students, and practitioners have been involved in all of these different projects. So another thing that would be great to spend a bunch of time on if we had a bunch of time are these recurring lessons. We have an article. These are kind of drawn out of an article you can see on our website. If you go to our website, we have a publications page. And one of the publications is called Why Collaborate, Why Involve Universities. And it's a little op-ed that I did for the Evans School Review a number of years ago. And these bullets kind of summarize that article. I'll just briefly put the bullets up, but probably won't have a lot of time to talk about them here. And this is basically getting us, this will wrap us up with some time for Q&A. So anyway, some of these recurring lessons, just real briefly, that I've taken away from my 30 years in the field. Not really rocket science, but it's kind of surprising how some of these basics don't really survive in a policy environment all the time. One is that for collaborative processes to be successful, it's really important that the goals and objectives of the process are clear, concise, and shared by those at the table and those receiving the results. It's quite often people will get underway and they're so eager to get to the content. Hey, let's just start resolving, let's reach agreement, but they don't take the time to be really clear about what it is they're trying to achieve. And often people will come into the process and not really be at the table for the same reasons. So it's really important to spend the time early on making sure that everybody understands what the goal of the process is and has a shared understanding of that. And a big important part of that is starting with a shared vision of the future. Instead of talking about what are we in conflict about today, it's very useful to start with where do we want to be in the future? What does success look like? And how far out do we need to go to articulate a vision of success? Because quite often, people's vision of a successful future is actually very similar to one another. And establishing that shared vision of success, what does it look like if we're successful in the future, can be the first piece of consensus. And then you're actually able to build back from that to consensus at the present, if you've got your eyes on a prize that you all share in the future. Including all whose support is needed for implementation is sort of a fundamental starting point. If you don't have everybody around the table who's going to be needed to implement the results, then you're not ready to start working towards an agreement. I would now add to this that you also need to think about who is typically not included in these conversations, but is affected by the outcomes, because you may have an equity issue if you're just bringing the usual suspects, even if those people are fully capable of implementing a solution. But there are people who are affected by the outcomes and are left out of these conversations historically, then it's time to broaden your horizons and start thinking about the people who have been historically left out. Determining if anyone has a BATNA. This is a term you may or may not have heard of. If you've ever read Getting to Yes, sort of a classic negotiation, win-win negotiation text, then you'll have heard of this term, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. very simply, the idea is if anybody perceives that they have a better, they don't actually have to objectively have a better alternative to a negotiated agreement, but if they perceive that they can get what they want some other way other than coming to a table and negotiating, then there's really not a point in having a negotiated process. So the facilitator needs to be paying attention to how people perceive that whether or not this table is their best alternative. I also think that it's important people are at the table voluntarily, because if they're not there voluntarily, they don't really have much incentive to negotiate in good faith. This idea of avoiding consensus fallbacks, if you build into your charter or whatever, well, we're going to try to reach consensus, but if we can't get everyone in consensus, can we have consensus -1? Or if we can't reach consensus, then we'll vote. Then you sort of build in this release valve that destroys everybody's incentive to actually work towards consensus. And you have to have a clear definition of consensus. What does consensus mean? And we have pretty good definitions that have worked for us that we could talk about. And I think it helps a lot. Not all consensus building or collaborative processes involve a neutral third party, and we can talk about what the term neutral might mean. But like a third party facilitator, I find that it generally is helpful if there's someone there who A, is an expert on process, and B, does not have a stake in the outcome. So having said all that, we can talk about whatever we want in the final 15 minutes or so that we have left. But here's a couple questions that I would tee up. Have you ever participated in a process you consider collaborative governance? And what other questions do you have? Thank you for being so patient in a format that is a little bit more me talk, you listen than I'd prefer, but it's sort of what we're stuck with in these times. And yeah, Hannah, what questions have people asked?
Yeah, we have a question. Can you talk about establishing ground rules and operating procedures? What do some of these entail and how are they established?
Yeah, so they can happen in different ways. Quite often, a facilitator or mediator can kind of bring in a sort of proposed first cut at a set of ground rules that then the parties can. I mean, I would never recommend that the mediator brings in a set and says this is going to be the ground rules. I think it should always be the parties at the table who finalize those ground rules. Sometimes it's helpful to have the mediator start, bring in a set. Sometimes you just want to start from scratch and have the first time that the group meets that they work to develop their own ground rules. That can be really helpful, but it has to be something that the group really owns, and that it's a set of ground rules that are going to work for them, and that meet their own individual needs. When I teach, I always make sure when I'm teaching collaborative governance that we go over examples. We bring in a number of examples and have people go through them and sort of figure out what they like from these different examples and put them together. A really important part, when Amanda goes through situation assessments, she'll talk about the importance of an assessment process, that before a group gets together, the ability for the facilitator to have one-on-one conversations with all the parties. And one of the things you do there is ask them about the things you learn from that assessment, help you to put together an initial set of ground rules that the parties can then, you learn a lot about, like, what are the ground rules going to be that are going to be important to this group? And you might ask them explicitly, who would need to be at the table, and how do you think that they're going to need to operate? What type of ground rules do you think will be important for this group? So that's one thing that can be sussed out as part of an assessment process.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael.
Mhm.
Someone did ask if you could just reverse and go back to that last slide where you had that recurring lessons to have that up for us.
Sure,
and then
absolutely.
we have another question in the chat. Are groups such as No Labels a good idea with their problem solvers caucus in Congress?
Yeah, so there's a number of groups like that. No Labels is one. There's also the bipartisan uh, coalition. There's the National Coalition. Well, I mentioned the National Coalition for Deliberation and Dialogue. There's also um, the National Coalition for Civil Discourse. Um, there's a whole bunch of groups like that that have grown up, and I think that a lot of people are really concerned about the growing polarization, particularly at the national level, but you're also starting to see it, at state and local levels. I would say we're fortunate in the state of Washington. It is not like our state is without polarization, but knock wood, I feel like our state legislature is has remained more collegial and more functional than a lot of other state legislatures, and that's to their credit. And I think that's to the credit of leadership of both of our parties. So, again, I'm knocking wood. I hope I'm not jinxing anything, but I've seen a lot of kind of responsible leadership from both of our parties so far, which I'm happy to see. I mean, the Ruckelshaus Center is all about pragmatic and collaborative decision making. So yeah, of course we would be supportive of groups like a Problem Solvers Caucus in Congress and No Labels that are trying to continue to support functional and collaborative approaches to policymaking. I think that's good, and wish them all the sort of all the best. Each of those groups are trying different approaches. Problem Solvers Caucus is trying to find sort of middle ground solutions that people from both caucuses can support. The bipartisan policy group, one of the things they've done is to try and promote members of Congress hosting a legislator from another party on tours of their district. So like a Democrat will take a Republican on a tour of their district, which I think is a good idea. The National Center for Civil Discourse has been training state legislators to be trainers for other state legislators in other districts or in other states to go in and do trainings on how to make the transition from candidate to legislator, right? Because the tools you need to get elected are very different from the tools you need to be an effective legislator. And the latter requires a lot more collaboration than the former, right? It's not, you necessarily need to be kind of aggressive in order to get elected, but once you become a legislator, you need to be an effective legislator requires a lot more collaborative skills. And so they've, and they feel like the future of a collaborative Congress comes from legislators are really sort of future Congress people. So they're trying to grow more collaborative legislators because they'll be the future of Congress. And so there's all these different interesting strategies. And yeah, but I think that they've been pretty great.
Thanks, Michael. We have another great question from Matt in the chat. In what phase do collaborative efforts typically fail and why?
That is a good question. So one of the things when I first started teaching, the associate dean for academic affairs said, when you do the case studies, be sure to have at least one of them be one that didn't succeed. Don't just do a bunch of successes because you learn a lot from failures. And I said, well, I agree with the last part of that, but I actually think there is no such thing as a collaborative process, or I would say any public policy process that is, you could say is completely a success or completely a failure. Like they're always a mix. And so what I say to the students is pay attention in each of these case studies to the parts that were successful and the parts that were not successful. So I would add to that, to your question, that each one is different, and some of them fail. They fail all along the way. There's like some where I would say you know, oh, this one failed early, you know, like this one failed, this one, a lot of them struggle in implementation, but I think a lot of policy processes, whether they're specifically collaborative governance or not as much of a collaborative approach, really struggle in implementation. Others don't get as far as implementation, but implementation is the hardest, right? I mean, it's really hard to to keep the commitment over the long period of time that public policy requires to actually implement. It's hard to find the money. Implementing requires effective implementation, requires adaptive management. It's very rare that you know, the policy environment doesn't change, so you have to change how you implement. And it's really hard to get the money to monitor and adaptively manage because everybody's much more interested in moving on to the next thing. And then people, you know, change, move on to new careers or retire or whatever. And so you don't have the same people. So I think implementation is the hardest. But it can happen in all sorts of different places along the way. It's a great question. Do we have time for another one?
Yeah, I think so. A couple people commented just about some collaborative processes that they're working in. And Henry asks, does the Ruckelshaus Center provide a roster of facilitators?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So we don't have a formal roster right now. We have kept a list of facilitators that we know of, public policy facilitators in the state of Washington. And when a process is not something that's appropriate for us, you know, that either doesn't fit our criteria or we don't have the capacity, we're more than happy to pass on you know, opportunities onto this list and tell folks like, hey, there's this thing coming up and it's not a fit for us, so, you know, feel free to get in touch. So we're more than happy to do that. We've been talking lately about whether or not to try to do a formal roster. We have colleagues down at Portland State in Oregon who run a center sort of similar to ours, and they have something like a roster they call an affiliated practitioner team. And that's, you can always check them out. They do have some Washington providers on their list, and we've been starting to talk to them about whether there might be some way that we could potentially affiliate with them and make it a joint roster, or maybe learn from them and start our own based on that. It's a lot of administrative work, and we've just been sort of not large enough to be able to take that on yet, but it's something that we're starting to explore. But we certainly, at the very least, are able to pass on to all the folks that we're aware of, you know, put people in touch.
Awesome. I want to make sure that we honor everyone's time. It is 1 o'clock. Thank you so much, Michael. And this is so great. We get to have you again next week. There are a couple questions left, so I will make sure to get them to you, and we can figure out whether those answers go out in the email with the recording or if we touch base on them next week. So thank you all for being with us, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and we will see you again next week.
Yeah, and next week should be fun. We're going to talk about collaborative competencies, this book that the University Network for Collaborative Governance has put together, and I've tried to make it sort of fun, maybe even a little bit amusing, the way that we'll take that one on.
All right, thank you.